The first arrow landed 3 inches from her left boot. Mabel did not run. She had learned long ago that running only invited faster pursuit, and the forest surrounding Ashevale's northern border was no place to flee blindly, not with roots that curled like grasping fingers beneath the snow, and shadows thick enough to swallow a person whole. So instead, she stood still, her breath rising in pale ribbons against the bitter morning air, and listened. Silence. Then, the creak of a bowstring pulled taut somewhere in the gray tree line. She was 23 years old, an omega without a pack, without a mark, without a single person in this frozen kingdom who would grieve her absence. The rejection had been spoken aloud in the great hall of Coldmere Keep 11 months ago. Her former alpha's voice flat and final, his eyes already turned away before the last syllable fell. The bond had snapped like old rope, and the pain of it had left her hollow in a way that cold weather only made worse. But hollow was not the same as helpless. She counted her breaths. 1, 2. Then she heard something that changed everything. A child's sob. Small, choked, barely louder than wind through pine needles, coming from the cluster of boulders 10 paces to her right. She turned her head slowly, and found them. 2 children huddled behind the largest stone, pressed against each other with a particular desperation of those who understood, even at their young age, that stillness meant survival. A boy and a girl, both dark-haired, both wide-eyed, both dressed in fine wool cloaks now torn and muddied at the hems. The boy was perhaps 7 years old. The girl slightly younger, her cheek scraped raw against the rock. They were not Coldmere children. The silver threading in their cloaks, now half obscured by grime, told her that much. The bowstring creaked again. Closer. Mabel moved without deciding to. Her body simply went, crossing the distance between herself and the boulders in 4 long strides, dropping to her knees behind the stones and pulling both children against her chest before the boy could make a sound of surprise. Quiet, she mouthed, her finger pressed to her lips. The girl buried her face in Mabel's patched woolen cloak. The boy stared at her with eyes the color of a winter sky. Pale gray, shot through with something fierce and frightened in equal measure. From beyond the tree line, voices now. Low, rough, speaking in a dialect she half recognized from the eastern trade roads. Hunters. Not the kind who tracked deer. Mabel counted them by sound. 4 men, moving in a wide arc. They were searching methodically, which meant they had been trained, which meant whoever had sent them had resources and patience. She looked at the children. She looked at the arrows embedded in the snow and bark around her. 3 now, she counted, all aimed at the space she had just abandoned. They were aimed at me, she realized, to keep me from reaching the children. The understanding settled in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. She unwrapped her outer cloak, a heavy thing, coarse brown wool stitched with repairs she'd made herself over months of solitary travel, and pulled both children deeper inside it, arranging them against the curved rock so their dark hair would not catch the pale winter light. She tucked the fabric around them tightly, then remained where she was, kneeling in front of them, her back to the boulders, her body the only barrier between the children and the open snow. The girl whispered something into her cloak. Mabel felt small fingers grip her sleeve. Stay inside, she breathed, barely sound at all. No matter what you hear. The boy leaned close to her ear. They have been following us since dawn, he whispered. His voice was steadier than she expected from a child his age. Our guard is dead. Our escort fled. She nodded once. She did not tell him how badly that information rearranged her odds. The footsteps were closer now, crunch of frost-hardened snow, the soft percussion of men moving with purpose. She could see the shadow of the nearest one falling long and dark across the tree line's edge. She had no blade worth the name, only a short hunting knife worn thin at the edge, and the knowledge that 4 trained hunters would not be impressed by it. But she did not move. The shadow grew. She pressed her back harder against the stone and felt the cold of it bleed through her tunic, felt the fine trembling of the girl against her ribs, felt the boy's careful stillness beside them. That terrible, self-controlled quietness that no child should have to learn. the hunter stepped into the clearing. He was broad-shouldered, wearing dark leathers, a crossbow raised and already tracking. He scanned left, then right. Then his gaze landed on Mabel. He paused. She looked back at him. She did not move. Something in her stillness seemed to confuse him. Perhaps he had expected flight. Perhaps he had expected pleading. Instead, he found a young woman in a threadbare tunic kneeling in the snow with her chin lifted and her eyes steady, a ragged cloak wrapped around two invisible children. He raised the crossbow. A sound split the winter morning. Not an arrow, not a bowstring, but something older and deeper than either. A sound that came from the chest and the bones and the blood of something that was not entirely human. The growl rolled through the trees like the front edge of a storm. Every hair on Mabel's arms stood upright. The hunter spun. His three companions had gone silent somewhere in the trees. The shadow of something enormous crossed the clearing's far edge, moving at a speed that made no sense for something so large, its shape low to the ground, and then suddenly upright, massive, every line of it radiating fury and authority in equal measure. The hunters broke, not slowly, not with any attempt at bravery. They simply broke. The way men broke when something in the deep animal part of their mind told them that they were not the predator in this clearing. Footsteps crashing through snow, branches snapping, retreating sounds swallowed quickly by the forest's cold silence. Then nothing. Mabel's hands were steady against the children. She did not know how, precisely, but they were. The thing at the forest's edge was a man now, or returning to one, the shift settling around him the way a tide settles after a great wave. He was tall in the way that made the tree line seem lower. Dark hair, damp at the temples. A jaw set hard enough to cut stone. He wore a traveling cloak of deep charcoal wool, trimmed with black fur at the collar, now torn at one shoulder. A sword hung at his left hip, its hilt worn smooth from use. His eyes were the same pale gray, shot through with winter light, as the boy's eyes. He crossed the clearing in long strides that barely disturbed the snow. His gaze moved between the children and Mabel, with an expression she could not name. Something between relief and fury, and something rawer than either. Something he was visibly fighting to keep from his face. The boy broke from beneath Mabel's cloak and ran. "Father," he said, one word. But the way he said it contained an entire season's worth of fear, finally released. The man caught the boy against his chest without hesitation, one large hand cupping the back of his son's head, and for one unguarded moment, his eyes fell shut. Then the girl followed, and he gathered her in too, and Mabel watched the King of Ashvale, because she understood now, suddenly and completely, what the silver threading in those cloaks meant. Hold his children with a fierceness that made him look almost human. Almost. When he looked up, his eyes found Mabel immediately. She was still kneeling in the snow, her cloak missing, her tunic soaked through at the knees, her hands resting open in her lap. He studied her for a long moment. She studied him back. "You did not run," he said. His voice was low, and the authority in it was not performed. It was structural, the way stone was structural. "No," she said. "Why?" She looked at the children, then back at him. She had no eloquent answer, no speech prepared for the moment she would kneel in the snow and explain herself to an alpha king. Only the truth, which was small and unimpressive. "Someone had to stay," she said. The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. He looked at her for another moment. At the patched cloak she'd left around his children, at the knife at her belt, at the frost beginning to crystallize in her dark hair. His expression moved through something complex and unresolved, and then settled into careful blankness. "You will come to the keep," he said. It was not a question. Mabel rose slowly from the snow, her knees aching with cold, and looked at the children still pressed against their father's sides. The boy's fierce pale eyes watching her, the girl's hand still loosely holding a piece of her worn cloak. She had no pack, no allegiance, no place to go before the next frost. She nodded once. She had not yet begun to understand what she had agreed to. Ashvale Keep rose from the hillside like something that had grown there, rather than been built. A great mass of dark stone and mortar, its towers catching the last pale light of afternoon, its walls thick enough that the wind died entirely when you passed through the main gate. Mabel had seen keeps before, from the outside mostly, pressed against market crowds or watching from forest roads, while merchants and nobles passed through iron-banded doors that were never opened for people like her. She walked through these ones. Not at Sebastian's side. He moved ahead with his children close, exchanging low words with the guards who materialized from the gatehouse the moment his silhouette appeared on the road. But she was brought through, flanked by 2 soldiers in charcoal livery who kept a polite and pointed distance, and that was more than she had expected when she'd woken that morning in a frost-covered lean-to 3 miles from the border. The inner courtyard smelled of horse and hay and wood smoke, of cold iron and the particular mineral sharpness of stone that had held winter inside it for decades. Torches were being lit along the walls as the sky dimmed, their light warm and wavering against the gray stone. Stable hands moved quickly, breath misting, heads down. A blacksmith's hammer rang from somewhere beyond the eastern wall, steady and unhurried. It was, Mabel thought, the most alive place she had stood in nearly a year. She was taken not to a dungeon, which she had quietly prepared herself for, but to a small chamber in the keep's lower east wing, plainly furnished but clean. A narrow bed with a wool blanket, a wash basin of cold water, a single candle already burning on the stone ledge. The soldiers left without explanation and bolted the door from the outside, which clarified her status well enough. Guest, prisoner, something in between. She washed the mud from her hands and face, dried them on the rough cloth beside the basin, and sat on the edge of the bed. The candle threw soft shadows across the wall. Outside, the wind had found the gaps between the stones and was whispering through them steadily, a sound like someone telling a secret in a language she almost understood. She did not sleep. By mid-morning of the next day, she had met 3 people. The first was a woman named Etta, stout, gray-haired, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had managed a great household for long enough that she no longer found anything surprising. She brought Mabel a proper meal: dark bread, hard cheese, a bowl of thick root stew that steamed beautifully and tasted of thyme and smoked pork. She set it down, looked Mabel over with the frank assessment of someone examining livestock at market, and said, "You'll need a proper cloak. Yours has been claimed." "By the girl," Mabel said. Something shifted in Etta's expression. Not warmth, precisely, but recognition. "By Lady Petra, yes. She has not put it down." She paused at the door. "Eat all of it. You look like you haven't done so in some time." She wasn't wrong. The second person was the boy, Kian, she learned later, who appeared at her chamber door in the early afternoon, with 2 guards behind him looking profoundly uncomfortable about having followed a 7-year-old to a prisoner's room. He stood in the doorway with his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture of studied formality that sat oddly on his small frame, and looked at her with those pale winter eyes. "You kept your back to the stones," he said, without greeting. "You put yourself between us and the clearing." "Yes," she said. "You knew they would shoot. I thought they might." He was quiet for a moment, processing this with the gravity of someone much older. "Why did you not use us as a shield instead? It would have been safer for you." The question was so direct and so genuinely curious that Mabel simply answered it honestly. "Because you are children." He looked at her as if this were an answer that required filing carefully away for later examination. Then he gave a short, precise nod, inherited, she suspected, from his father, and left. The third person came just before the evening bell, and Mabel heard him before she saw him. Heavy boots on stone, a deliberate pace that paused outside her door long enough that she knew he had been standing there deciding something. Then the bolt slid back, and Sebastian entered. He was less frightening in firelight than he had been in the winter forest, which meant he was still considerably frightening. He had changed into cleaner clothes, a dark tunic, charcoal wool trousers, boots that reached the knee. But the sword was still at his hip, and the torn shoulder of his cloak had been replaced rather than mended, which told her something about how he valued his time. His dark hair was dry now, and slightly disheveled in a way that seemed constitutional rather than careless. He looked at the empty bowl on the floor beside her, and something in his jaw unclenched by a fraction. "You ate?" he said. "Your housekeeper is persuasive." He moved to stand near the narrow window, not sitting, keeping the room's width between them. Outside, the torches along the wall threw orange light across the snow below. He studied the courtyard for a moment before he spoke. "You were in the northern forest alone," he said. "No pack markings, no traveling party, Coldmere direction." She said nothing. It wasn't a question. "You are rejected," he said, also not a question. His nostrils had told him that the moment he'd entered the room, the absence of pack bond was as distinct a scent to an alpha as the presence of one. Coldmere's. The word landed on her the way it always did, bluntly, like an elbow to a bruise. 11 months ago, she confirmed, keeping her voice level. His eyes moved to her then, fully, with an attention that felt like being stepped into a current. "And you have been alone since?" "Yes." "Doing what?" "Moving," she said. "Working where work was offered, healing mostly. I trained as a secondary healer in Coldmere before." She stopped. Before. A silence settled between them. He turned back to the window. She watched the firelight move across the line of his shoulder and wondered what, precisely, was happening in the calculation she could see running behind his eyes. "My children's escort was ambushed 12 miles north of here," he said finally, his voice lower now, stripped of the formal register. 6 men. They were returning from a visit to my mate's kin. Her family holds land in the northern reaches. A pause. "My mate died 2 winters ago." Mabel absorbed this without expression. "The ambush was arranged," he continued. "Someone knew the route, the timing and the guard number. Someone with access to my household's movements." He turned from the window. "You understand what I am telling you?" "That there is someone in your keep who wants your children dead," she said. "Or taken." His jaw set. "Which is worse?" The candle between them guttered slightly in the draft from the window, and for a moment the shadows in the room deepened and shifted. "What do you want from me?" she asked. He looked at her for a long, measuring moment. "My children trust you," he said, and the careful flatness of his tone told her what that cost him to admit. That his children, who had been raised inside fortress walls with guards at every door, had decided in the space of a frozen morning that a penniless, packless Omega stranger was worth trusting. Particularly Kian. And Cian trusts no one. "He asked me a reasonable question," she said. "I gave him an honest answer. He told me what you said." Sebastian's voice changed, almost imperceptibly, the flatness softened by the width of a blade. "About children." She said nothing. "I cannot place a guard inside my children's chambers without knowing which of my guards is clean," he said. "My household has been compromised. My most trusted men are outside these walls pursuing the attackers. What remains is uncertainty." He straightened. "I need someone whose loyalty cannot have been purchased before they arrived." Mabel looked at him steadily. "You want me to stay near them?" "I want you in the keep," he said carefully, "in a capacity that gives you reason to move freely. I am told you have healer's training." "I do." "The keep's healer is elderly and requires assistance. The position is genuine." He paused. So is the purpose behind it. She thought of the northern forest and the arrow that had landed 3 inches from her left boot. She thought of the girl's fingers still gripping her worn cloak, and the boy's terrible, careful stillness behind the stone. She thought of 11 months of sleeping in lean-tos and moving through markets with her eyes down, belonging nowhere, accountable to no one, invisible in the way that only the discarded ever truly learn to be. "There is something you should know," she said. He waited. "If someone tries to harm those children while I am present," she said quietly, "I will not stand aside, regardless of rank or order or consequence to myself." She met his eyes. "I thought you should understand what you are agreeing to." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Heavier, more considered. Sebastian looked at her with an expression she still could not fully name, but something in it had shifted from the careful blankness of a king evaluating an asset to something more private and unresolved. "I understand," he said. He left without further ceremony. The bolt, she noticed, did not slide back into place behind him. She sat in the quiet room with the candle burning low and the wind breathing through the stones, and understood, slowly and with some unease, that she had just made herself necessary to the most powerful and most dangerous alpha in the northern kingdoms. And that somewhere in this keep, someone had already tried to kill his children once. The keep had a rhythm, and Mabel learned it the way she learned most things. Quietly, through observation, without drawing attention to the fact that she was paying attention at all. She rose before the household bell, when the corridors were still dark, and the only sounds were the distant clang of the night watch changing shifts and the low murmur of wind finding its way through ancient mortar. She would dress in the plain gray tunic and heavy skirt Etta had provided, serviceable wool, nothing more, pull her dark hair back with a strip of linen, and make her way to the healer's quarters in the keep's north wing before the first servants appeared. The elderly healer was named Brother Oswin, a spare, deliberate man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of muttering to himself in the old tongue while he sorted his dried herbs. He was, she discovered quickly, genuinely skilled and genuinely glad of her presence, which simplified things considerably. She catalogued his stores, restocked what had grown scarce, learned his methods and his preferences, and in doing so, gave herself a reason to move through the keep's corridors at almost any hour without raising questions. This was the position as Sebastian had framed it. Genuine, he had said. So is the purpose behind it. She held both in mind simultaneously, and let neither distract from the other. The children she encountered carefully, not seeking them, never appearing to monitor them, but present. She took her midday meal in the great hall at the lower tables where the servants ate, and Cian had developed a habit, within the first 3 days, of appearing at the far end of her bench with a book, and sitting in companionable silence while he read and she ate. He never asked permission. He simply arrived, as if the arrangement were obvious. Petra was less contained. The younger child had taken to following Mabel to the herb garden in the afternoons, a small enclosed yard on the keep's south side, where a few stubborn plants survived the winter under straw coverings, and asking a continuous, rambling series of questions about every plant, tool, and bird that came within her line of sight. She was 6 years old, missing 2 teeth, and possessed of an opinion on everything. Mabel's worn cloak had been returned. Eventually, clean and carefully folded, left outside her chamber door one morning with no note. She suspected Etta had engineered the washing. She suspected Petra had engineered everything else. Sebastian she saw at a distance, mostly. He moved through the keep with the particular kind of deliberate speed that suggested a man managing more crises than he had hours for. Always accompanied by at least 2 advisors or guards. Always with papers or a sword or both. He did not acknowledge her in the corridors, which she understood as protective rather than dismissive. The less connection visible between them, the less useful she was as a target. But she felt his awareness of her. An alpha's awareness was not something an omega without a bond had easy language for. It was not warmth, precisely. Not pressure. But a kind of orientation. The way a lodestone oriented toward north even through stone walls. He knew where she was. She was increasingly certain of it. What she was less certain about was the source of the rot she could smell growing inside the keep's walls. It started with small things. A set of keys went missing from the steward's ring, and reappeared 3 days later on a hook they had never occupied. A kitchen servant mentioned, offhandedly, that the duty roster for the gate guard had been altered the week before the ambush. She had assumed it was an administrative correction, had thought nothing of it until Mabel asked gentle questions about how rosters were typically changed. A bundle of letters in Brother Oswin's supply cabinet turned out to contain, beneath 3 layers of dried sage, a folded page of instructions written in a hand that was not the old healer's. Instructions for a compound that, in sufficient quantity, would produce prolonged unconsciousness in an adult male without obvious evidence. Oswin had never seen it before. His hands shook when she showed him. She told him to say nothing to anyone, replace the sage, and carried the page with her folded inside her belt for the rest of the day. She brought it to Sebastian that evening. He read it twice, standing at his writing table with the candlelight across his face, and his expression doing the careful work of revealing nothing. Then he set it down flat on the table and looked at her. "Where?" he said. She told him. She also told him about the keys and the roster and the kitchen servant's offhand comment, laid out in order, without embellishment. He listened the way powerful men rarely listened, completely, without interrupting, without looking away. When she finished, the silence lasted long enough that she could hear the fire settle in the grate. "This was placed in Oswin's cabinet," he said finally. "Oswin, whose chambers connect directly to the children's corridor." "Yes," she said. His jaw was stone. "Someone in this keep has been planning this for longer than the ambush." "Yes." He pushed back from the table and moved to the fire, standing with one hand braced on the mantel, staring into the flames with the focused blankness of a man doing rapid and unpleasant calculation. The torn cloak had been replaced again, a new one, deep charcoal, clasped at the shoulder with a simple iron pin. She noticed, not for the first time, that he wore no jewelry, no ornamentation. Everything about him was stripped to function. "You took a risk bringing this to me directly," he said without turning. "I considered alternatives," she said. "There weren't any I trusted." He turned then, and the firelight was full on his face, and she saw something she had not expected. A fracture in the careful blankness, something tired and solitary, moving behind his eyes for just a moment before he closed it back. "My first advisor arrives from the southern border in 4 days," he said. "Roderick. He has served this house since before I held it. If there is rot in these walls, he will help me find it. And until then?" "Until then," he said, "you continue as you are. See what you see. Tell me what you find." She nodded and moved toward the door. "Mabel." She stopped. He had not used her name before. He'd barely used it since she'd given it in the forest. It sounded different spoken aloud in this room. Careful, slightly weighted, as if he had been holding it at arm's length and had just decided to set it down. "The compound in that page," he said. "You recognized it immediately." "I did. Most healers wouldn't. Most healers weren't trained under an alpha who required them to know what could be used against him," she said, and the flatness in her own voice surprised her slightly, the old bitterness surfacing before she could decide to keep it down. His gaze sharpened, not with suspicion, with something more careful than that. "Coldmere's alpha," he said. "He valued preparedness," she said, "in everyone around him, for his own protection, not theirs." Another silence, longer. "That kind of training," Sebastian said slowly, "does not come without cost." She held his gaze. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." She left before he could say anything else, and walked the cold corridor back toward the north wing with her hands steady, and the folded page gone from her belt, and something uncomfortable sitting in her chest. Not grief, not quite, but the particular ache of a wound that had been closed over rather than healed. Pressed briefly by the shape of someone else's attention, she found Cian outside her chamber door when she returned. He was sitting against the wall, with his knees drawn up and his eyes open, very awake for the late hour. "You went to my father," he said. She crouched to his level. "You should be asleep." "I heard your steps going toward the East Tower. That's where he works at night." He looked at her with those precise, disconcerting eyes. "Did you find something?" She studied him for a moment. 7 years old and already reading corridors by footfall patterns. "I found something," she said carefully. "Your father knows. It is being handled." "By you," he said. "And him." Yes. He absorbed this. Then, with the same careful formality he'd used when he'd first appeared in her doorway. "I am glad you are here." It was a simple sentence. It did what simple sentences sometimes did. It went straight through her guard and landed somewhere she hadn't thought to protect. She helped him back to his chamber, checked the bolt on the adjoining door, looked in on Petra sleeping soundly with her thumb curled near her mouth, and the worn brown cloak spread across her feet like a blanket. She stood in the doorway for a moment, in the quiet dark. Somewhere in this keep, someone was waiting. Someone who knew the rosters and the corridors and the supply cabinets, who had been patient and careful and invisible for long enough to arrange an ambush on a road 12 miles from these walls. She walked back to her own chamber, sat on the edge of the narrow bed, and began making a list in her mind of every person she had observed in 11 days inside Ashvale Keep. She did not sleep for a long time. Roderick arrived on the 4th day as promised, riding through the keep's main gate at mid-morning with 6 men at his back, and a manner that filled a room before he entered it. He was perhaps 50 years old, broad through the chest and shoulders in the way of men who had once been formidable fighters and had allowed time to settle rather than soften them. His beard was iron gray, close-cropped, and his eyes were a sharp, assessing brown beneath heavy brows that seemed permanently arranged in mild disapproval of whatever they happened to be observing. He wore the charcoal livery of Ashvale's house, but with a deep red sash across the chest, the mark of a first advisor, Mabel learned from Etta, awarded by Sebastian's father, and never rescinded. He had served the Ashvale line for 30 years. He knew every stone of this keep, every face in its service, every road that led to and from its gates. Which meant, Mabel thought, watching from the upper corridor as he dismounted below, that he was either the most valuable ally Sebastian had in finding the rot, or the rot itself, grown so deep and so old that it had become structural. She did not share this thought with anyone. Roderick took his evening meal at the high table with Sebastian and the children, a custom she was told he maintained on every visit. The first advisor's presence at the family table was a tradition stretching back generations, a visible symbol of the bond between the Ashvale line and its most senior council. Mabel ate at her usual bench below and watched without appearing to. Roderick was good with the children. That was the first thing she noted, and it unsettled her in a way she had to examine carefully. He spoke to Kian with genuine interest, listening to the boy's precise reports on his lessons with the attentiveness of someone who valued young minds. He brought Petra a small carved wooden bird from the southern roads, a beautifully made thing, wings spread mid-flight, and the girl's delight was immediate and unperformed. Mabel watched Petra hold the carved bird. She watched Kian's guarded face relax slightly in Roderick's company. She noted that Sebastian's shoulder lost some of its tension when his advisor spoke, the particular relief of a man whose most trusted counsel had returned. She noted all of it, and kept her own counsel, and said nothing. 3 days after Roderick's arrival, a stable hand named Pell was found unconscious in the hay stores at dawn. He was breathing, shallow, slow, the particular rhythm she recognized immediately from the compound instructions she'd found in Oswin's cabinet. She was called to him before Brother Oswin, which surprised her until she realized it was Kian who had sent for her specifically, the boy having apparently decided she was the keep's primary healer, regardless of formal title. She worked over Pell for 2 hours, administering what counterbalancing herbs she had, keeping him on his side, monitoring his pulse with 2 fingers at his wrist, while the stable boys hovered in the doorway and the morning light crept across the hay-strewn floor. By mid-morning, he was conscious, confused, and unable to account for the previous evening after his second cup of ale at the servants' table. Mabel sat back on her heels and looked at the empty cup still sitting near the hay bale where he'd apparently fallen. The compound. In ale, given to a stable hand. She turned the logic of it over carefully. Pell was young, barely 17, slight, with the perpetually wind-burned face of someone who spent his days outdoors. He had no obvious significance to the household's politics. He was not a guard, not a messenger, not anyone with access to sensitive information or the children's corridors. But he was, she recalled, the boy assigned to saddle horses for the children's use. He would have had advance notice of any journey they took within the keep's grounds. Someone had silenced him before he could be questioned. She brought this to Sebastian privately, an hour later, in the narrow corridor outside the healer's rooms, while Brother Oswin was occupied with his afternoon inventory. Sebastian listened with his back to the wall, and his arms crossed, and that particular stillness that she had come to understand was not composure, but its controlled opposite, a man holding something very large very carefully in place. "Pell is the third," Sebastian said when she finished. She stared at him. "Third. Alondris took ill 6 weeks ago. We attributed it to winter fever." He met her eyes. "A gate guard the week before that. Same symptoms." He recovered slowly. "I did not connect them then." His jaw tightened. "I connect them now. 3 people. A pattern of silencing, not killing. Whoever was doing this was careful. Careful enough to use doses that incapacitated without leaving obvious evidence. Careful enough to choose targets who touched the periphery of the children's routine without being central enough to raise immediate alarm. They are removing witnesses," she said quietly. "Anyone who might notice changes in routine, alterations to schedules." "Clearing the ground," Sebastian said, and the flatness in his voice was the kind that came from fury held at too great a distance for too long. She hesitated, then said what she had been turning over for 3 days. The compound in Oswin's cabinet was specific knowledge. It required access to that room and familiarity with what would and would not be noticed among a healer's supplies. She paused. It also required understanding of Ashvale's household routines at a deep level, not a servant's level, a steward's, or an advisor's. The silence that followed was very long. Sebastian looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read. Something moving through it. Some particular resistance or grief or both. "You are speaking of Roderick," he said. "I am speaking of the level of access required," she said carefully. "I am not speaking of Roderick specifically. But you are thinking of him." She held his gaze. "I am thinking of everyone. That is what you asked me to do." Another silence. She watched him work through something. Loyalty against evidence. Trust against pattern. 30 years of faithful service against 3 unconscious servants, and a page of compound instructions tucked beneath dried sage. "He loved these children's mother," Sebastian said finally, quietly, in a voice stripped of all its formal register. He watched her buried. He wept. He looked toward the window. "I cannot believe." "I know," she said. And she did know. She understood precisely the particular agony of revising your understanding of someone you had trusted. She had learned it herself, in a great hall in Coldmere, in front of witnesses. "I am not asking you to believe it," she continued. "I am asking you to be careful, to let me watch and tell you what I see." He looked at her for a long moment with those pale gray eyes, and the fire somewhere behind them, banked low and carefully controlled. "There is a gathering of the northern lords in 12 days, he said. "The keep will be full of strangers. It is the kind of disruption someone would use. Then we have 12 days to find what I am looking for before they arrive." "We," he repeated. The word was brief, almost nothing. But the way he said it, not correcting it, not distancing himself from it, told her something. She returned to the healer's rooms and her work, and spent the afternoon cataloging Oswin's entire supply cabinet from top to bottom, noting every item, every quantity, everything that was present, and everything that should have been present and was not. She found 2 things missing. The first was a small jar of powdered foxglove, a potent substance, dangerous in excess, used carefully for heart complaints. The second was a bundle of wolfsbane, which had no legitimate healer's use in the quantities that had been stored, and whose absence from the cabinet was something Brother Oswin, when she asked him gently, could not account for. She sat with this information in the quiet of the herb room while the afternoon light went gray outside the narrow window, the cold pressing through the stone, and thought about what someone would need wolfsbane for. Wolfsbane was one of the few substances that could affect a shifted alpha. In sufficient concentration, it could incapacitate even the most powerful wolf. Someone in Ashvale Keep was not planning to abduct the children. They were planning to take the king. She went to Sebastian that same night. The east tower was lit from within, amber light pressing through the narrow window slits as she climbed the spiral stair, her hand trailing the cold, curved wall for balance. The stone here was older than the rest of the keep. Rougher, darker, with the particular solidity of something built to outlast the people who had commissioned it. Her boots made almost no sound on the worn steps. She knocked twice and entered without waiting, which was a liberty she had not taken before. He looked up from the writing table with a sharpness that softened by 1 degree when he saw it was her. "The foxglove and the wolfsbane," she said, and set her written list on the table in front of him. He read it. She watched his face move through the understanding in stages. First the practical assessment, then the specific implication, then the full weight of it settling behind his eyes like a door closing. "They are not coming for the children," he said. "The children may still be part of it," she said carefully. "Taking them would be leverage. But the primary target is me." He sat back. An alpha king incapacitated by wolfsbane cannot shift, cannot fight at full strength, cannot lead his pack. He said it with the flat precision of someone reading a military assessment, not a death warrant. "In that state, I would be simple to take, or to kill." "The Northern Lords' gathering," she said. 12 days. A keep full of strangers and their retinues. The confusion of it. "Would be sufficient cover," he finished. The fire in the grate had burned low, throwing long shadows across the writing table and the stacked correspondence and the worn leather of the chair opposite his. He looked at the list again, then set it face down and pressed 2 fingers to his brow with the weariness of a man who had not slept properly in longer than he would admit. "I need to tell Roderick," he said. The words landed carefully between them. Mabel said nothing. She had told him what she had found. She had told him the level of access required. She had been as clear as she could be, without making an accusation she could not yet prove, and now she watched him arrive at the same threshold she had been standing at for 3 days. "If it is not Roderick," Sebastian continued slowly, "then I need him. He knows every man in my household guard. He can help me identify who else has that level of access." He looked up. "And if it is Roderick, then telling him warns him," she said quietly. "And he disappears and takes whatever evidence exists with him, and tries again from a safer distance." The silence between them was the kind that had consequences. "There is a third possibility," she said. "You tell Roderick a partial truth. Enough to read his reaction. Not enough to expose what we actually know." Sebastian looked at her with an attention that she had almost grown accustomed to. Almost, because it was not a thing one entirely grew accustomed to, being looked at that carefully by someone that capable of seeing clearly. "You have done this before," he said. "Moved carefully inside a household that could not be trusted." The old bitterness rose again, and she let it pass through without expression. "I spent 4 years in Coldmere learning which corridors were safe and which conversations were being listened to," she said. "Not by choice." He held her gaze. "He was cruel to you." It was not a question. It was an observation spoken quietly, without embellishment, in the way of someone who had assembled pieces over time and had arrived at an understanding they wished they hadn't. "He was what he was," she said. "It doesn't matter now." "It matters," Sebastian said, with a quietness that was different from his usual careful register. Lower, more private, the voice of a man speaking for himself rather than his position. "What was done to you matters." She looked away first. At the fire, at the dark window, at the list of missing items lying face down on the table between them. "Tell Roderick that the healer's stores were disturbed," she said, steadying her voice. "Tell him you suspect a servant may have been stealing for resale. Watch his face. Watch what questions he asks and which ones he doesn't." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Then, and if his face tells me nothing? Then we look elsewhere, she said, but it will tell you something. She was not present for the conversation. She learned its shape afterward, through what Sebastian did not say and what she observed in Roderick at the evening meal. The first advisor sat at the high table with his usual presence, his iron-gray beard, and his shrewd brown eyes, and his easy authority over the space around him. He spoke to Sebastian with the familiarity of decades. He ruffled Tien's hair with a roughness the boy bore with tolerant dignity. He asked Petra about the carved bird, and listened with apparent pleasure as she named it and described its habits in detail. He was, to every visible measure, exactly what he had always been. Except that twice during the meal, his gaze moved to the lower tables. Not scanning, not casual, searching, landing briefly on faces, and moving on with the efficiency of a man checking a list he carried internally. He was looking for someone specific. When his eyes found Mabel, they stayed for precisely one breath longer than they stayed on anyone else. She was looking at her bread when it happened and did not look up. But she felt it. The way you felt a change in wind direction before the temperature dropped. She brought this to Sebastian the following morning, outside the herb garden where the cold was sharp enough that their breath made clouds, and the conversation could not be overheard by anyone without standing in the open with them. He searched the lower tables, Sebastian said. He was not asking. For me, I think, she said. He knows someone has been watching. He may not know it's me specifically, but someone told him the healer's stores had been examined. Someone who was there when Oswin and I catalogued the cabinet. There were 2 kitchen servants who brought water to the healer's rooms that afternoon, Sebastian said. His voice had gone very flat. I can account for one of them. The other requested leave the following morning to visit family in the lower village. Has he returned? No. She absorbed this. A messenger. Then, someone low enough to be invisible, paid to watch and report. The rot had more branches than she'd initially traced. Sebastian. She said his name carefully. She had started using it in private 3 days ago, without quite deciding to. He had not corrected her. If Roderick is the source, if this goes back 30 years of access and trust, he will not move until he is ready. He is too careful for that. But the gathering of lords accelerates his timeline, whether he wants it to or not. He cannot let that window close. 12 days, Sebastian said. Less now. 9. He stood in the cold with the herb garden's bare, straw-covered beds around them, and the wall's shadow falling long across the frost. And for a moment, he was not a king calculating. He was simply a man standing at the edge of something very large, looking down. Katrin, he said quietly. My mate. She died of a fever. That was what I was told. That was what the healer recorded. He paused. The healer who retired suddenly 3 months after her death and has not been heard from since. The cold between them deepened. I did not question it, he continued. I was grieving. My children were small. I needed the keep to function. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, but its close cousin. I trusted the account because I trusted the man who gave it to me. Mabel understood, with a slow and terrible clarity, what he was telling her. Not just that Roderick might be behind the ambush and the poisonings and the wolfsbane, but that the rot might go back further. All the way back to a fever that had not been a fever. You cannot act on that yet, she said carefully. Not without evidence. Not without proof that would hold before your lords. I know, he said. The flatness of his voice was the kind that came from controlling something that would be devastating if released. We need him to act first, she said. We need him to move, and when he does, we need to be ready. He looked at her, the pale gray of his eyes in winter morning light. You are asking me to use my children as bait, he said quietly. No, she said immediately, firmly. I am asking you to create the appearance that your children are unguarded, while ensuring that they are not. There is a difference. And who ensures that they are not? She held his gaze. The answer was obvious enough that she didn't speak it. He looked at her for a long moment, at the patched, cold-reddened hands and the plain gray wool, and the steady dark eyes of a woman who had been discarded and had survived it, and had somehow arrived here, at the center of a danger she had not asked for, and had not yet flinched. "If something happens to you inside these walls," he said very quietly, "because I placed you in the path of this—" "Something already happened to me," she said, "before I ever came through your gate. I am still standing." The silence that followed was different from all the ones before it. Warmer, somehow, despite the cold. He nodded once, the gesture of a man making a decision that cost him something. "Then we prepare," he said. And for the first time since she had walked through Ashvale's gate behind two politely threatening soldiers, Mabel felt something shift in the hollow place the rejection had left. Not filling it, not yet, but something pressing gently against its edges from the outside. Something that felt, distantly and carefully, and without any certainty, like not being alone. She did not examine it too closely. There was still work to do. The trap was simple, because simple things were harder to anticipate. Sebastian announced at the evening meal, with Roderick seated 3 places to his right, that he would ride out at dawn to inspect the northern border fortifications. A journey of 2 days that would take him away from the keep. The children, he said, would remain under Edda's supervision. No additional guard rotation. A routine arrangement, nothing noteworthy. Mabel ate her bread at the lower table and did not look at Roderick. She felt his gaze find her twice. She was in the children's corridor before the midnight bell, settled in the alcove beside the storage room with the stone cold at her back, and the candle extinguished. She had told Kian only that she would be nearby and that he should sleep. He had looked at her with those winter-gray eyes and said nothing, which was its own kind of understanding. She waited in the dark. 2 hours past midnight, she heard it. The soft, deliberate sound of boots that knew exactly where the creaking boards were and stepped around them. Not a servant. Not a guard making rounds. Someone who had memorized this corridor over years, perhaps decades, of walking it as a trusted presence. A shadow filled the far end of the passage. Roderick moved with the confidence of a man who believed himself unobserved. He carried a small clay vial in his left hand. His right rested on the knife at his belt. Not drawing it, simply resting, the habit of someone who had decided that what came next might require it. He reached Kian's door. Mabel stepped out of the alcove. She said nothing. She simply stood between Roderick and the door, in the dark corridor, with her hands at her sides and her feet planted on the cold stone. He stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. She could see his face in the faint light bleeding under the door from within. The iron-gray beard, the shrewd eyes, the particular blankness of a man recalculating rapidly. "Move aside," he said quietly, almost gently. "You have no idea what you are standing in the middle of, girl." "I know exactly what I am standing in the middle of," she said. "I have known for 9 days." Something shifted in his expression. The gentleness left it. "You are a packless Omega who wandered in from the forest," he said. "You have no standing here, no authority, no protection." "No," she agreed. "I don't." She did not move. He took 1 step forward. She held her ground. "Roderick." The voice came from the far end of the corridor, low, controlled, carrying the particular resonance of an alpha who was not shifting, but was close enough to it that the air in the passage changed. Sebastian stepped into the light with 2 of his most trusted outer guard at his back, men who had ridden in quietly from the northern border at dusk, and entered the keep through the old postern gate that Roderick had not known was still functional. Roderick turned. The vial disappeared into his palm. "My lord," he said. The tone was remarkable, still composed, still carrying 30 years of practiced authority. "There has been a misunderstanding." "Katrin," Sebastian said. 1 word. Quiet as a blade withdrawn from a sheath. The composure cracked, not dramatically, just a fracture at the edges of Roderick's expression, there and gone in a breath, but present. Enough. You had access to her food, Sebastian continued, walking forward slowly. You recommended the healer who attended her final illness. You arranged his retirement. You have spent 2 years clearing every witness who might have remembered something inconvenient. He stopped 6 feet from his first advisor. Why? Roderick was silent for a long moment. Then, with the exhaustion of a man setting down a very heavy thing, your father promised this house to a different line, before you were born, an arrangement made, and then unmade when he changed his mind. His voice was flat. I served that promise for 30 years. I served you, genuinely, faithfully for 30 years. And then she changed everything. Her family's alliance threatened to expose the old arrangement. To expose me. So you killed her, Sebastian said. I protected the house, Roderick said, and the terrible thing was that he believed it. The guards took him at Sebastian's signal. He did not fight. He walked with them with the dignity of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last 30 seconds, that the performance was over. The clay vial was taken from his hand. It was wolfsbane, concentrated. Enough, Brother Oswin confirmed later, to have incapacitated an adult alpha for hours. It had never been about the children. They were leverage, nothing more. The true plan had been Sebastian, taken in apparent absence, with the keep in the hands of those Roderick had quietly positioned over months, the northern lords arriving to find a kingdom without its king and a first advisor ready to manage the transition. 30 years of patience. And at the end of it, a woman in a threadbare tunic standing in a dark corridor between him and a child's door. The trials were held before the assembled northern lords, as Sebastian had intended, the gathering becoming something other than what Roderick had planned for it. The evidence was thorough. The testimony was clear. The verdict took less time than the assembling of it. Roderick was stripped of his sash and exiled to the eastern reaches, beyond Ashvale's borders, for the remainder of his days. It was more mercy than many advised. Sebastian gave it anyway, because he had decided, in the quiet of his own council, that he did not want his children to grow up in a keep where justice was performed rather than practiced. The healer who had attended Katrin's final illness was found in a coastal village 3 weeks later. His testimony confirmed what the evidence had already established. Sebastian heard it alone, in the East Tower, with the fire low and the door closed. Mabel did not ask him what that evening cost him. She simply left a cup of hot herb tea outside his door and went back to her work. He found her in the herb garden the following afternoon. The cold still sharp, the straw-covered bed still waiting for spring. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. She did not fill the silence. I owe you more than I can properly name, he said finally. You owe me nothing, she said. I stayed because it was right to stay. That is not the only reason you stayed. She looked at the bare garden, at the frost on the stone wall, at the place where green things would eventually push through if given enough time and enough quiet. No, she admitted. It isn't. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with speeches. Simply took it, the way you took hold of something you did not intend to release, and stood beside her in the cold. I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give, he said quietly. I am only asking you not to leave. She looked at their hands, then at him. She had been rejected and hollowed, and had walked through a winter forest alone and placed herself between 2 children and an arrow without anyone asking her to, and had spent weeks inside a keep full of danger holding her ground in dark corridors with no authority and no protection and nothing but the knowledge of what was right and the stubbornness to act on it. She was still standing. I'm not leaving, she said. Spring was still months away, but in the herb garden's quiet cold, something shifted, the particular quality of air before green things begin. Epilogue. Petra named the carved wooden bird Roderick before anyone thought to stop her, and then refused to rename it on principle. It sat on her windowsill for years, watching the courtyard below. Cian grew into his father's stillness and his mother's warmth in equal measure, and became in time the kind of leader who listened before he spoke. Brother Oswin retired the following spring with a written record of every herb in his cabinet, annotated in his careful hand, and left his keys on Mabel's workbench without ceremony. Mabel was formally bonded to Sebastian of Asheville on a morning in early spring, when the first green shoots were pressing through the garden's cold soil. A quiet ceremony, witnessed by Etta and the children, and a handful of guards who had ridden in from the northern border for the occasion. She wore her own cloak, repaired and cleaned, because she had decided that was exactly right. The hollow place the rejection had left did not fill overnight. It filled the way gardens filled, slowly, through tending, through seasons, through the accumulation of small, ordinary days in which someone chose to stay. She chose it every day. That was enough. That was everything.